Year's message.
Well, yes, our New Year's message and New Year's Day. I hope everyone has had a nice New Year's so far. I had a nice New Year's Eve. We got down to Charlottetown last night and took in the fireworks. Very impressive display over the water. It was quite beautiful. And and the Taylor Swift cover band. They were pretty fun too. Yeah, I would say. Not that I'm a Taylor Swift fan, but I did find her music. Anyway, it was good. It was fun, I must say. What's that? It's not like Ontario. Yes. Well, this morning, what I was thinking about earlier, I mentioned the word servant or servanthood and fellowship, and thinking about, there are some words that we use that are very sort of, I like to say that we claim these as being like Christian words. We want to claim them for ourselves. Not that we don't want to share them, but there's something distinctly Christian about those words. Like when I think about volunteers in a church, I like to say, no, we don't have volunteers in a church. We have servants in a church because we're here to serve one another. So servanthood feels like one of those Christian words. There's something distinct about it. But the other word is fellowship. Certainly fellowship is a word that's used in other places. Like you can get a research grant, a fellowship grant. This time of year, Christmas, how many years ago was it? Everybody was thinking about the Fellowship of the Ring with the release of the Lord of the Rings, the trilogy, year after year over the Christmas season. But fellowship has a real kind of Christian sense to it. And I wonder if I think that in particular is maybe in part because of the way I was raised. I was raised in a church where we had this practice. We would take communion every week, but our communion would be in a separate service. We'd have like the communion service, the breaking of bread, and then we'd have our regular church service. And if you wanted to come and partake and be part of that breaking of bread service, and you're visiting, you would need to bring a letter with you. And it would need to be a letter from the elders of your church. And what would happen is at the beginning of the service, someone would get up, the elder of the church would get up, and they'd read the letter saying basically, so-and-so is here visiting, we commend them to you to enjoy the breaking of bread together. And then that person would sit down, and then suddenly somebody would break into a song. One of the men in the congregation would sing, and one of the verses of the song had these words to it. There was, "Blessed be the tie that binds our hearts in Christian love. The fellowship of kindred minds is like to that above." Beautiful little song that we would sing, and it conveys this idea that our fellowship that we share with one another is like the fellowship of the Trinity. It's like to that above. This beautiful fellowship, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and we get to participate in that when we live in fellowship with one another. So I think, yes, other people can use the word fellowship. We don't own it, but there's something very distinctive about it in terms of how we understand it. It's divine, isn't it? This word fellowship. So I'd love for us to think about fellowship a bit this morning as we move into 2023. What is our fellowship like, and how do we live in fellowship with one another? And we'll begin by just reading from some verses. So from Hebrews chapter 3, I'm going to read verses 1, verses 12, and 13. Hebrews chapter 3 says, "Therefore, holy brothers and sisters who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus, whom we acknowledge as our apostle and high priest." And then down to verse 12. See to it, brothers and sisters," or in another translation, the Common English Bible, it says, watch out, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God, but encourage one another daily as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. So we see in the first verse, verse 1, these words, heavenly calling. I think this heavenly calling, we can understand this as being given us this image that we are like pilgrims on a journey, that we are moving towards this place, this promised land that we know as heaven. And our fellowship is like a pilgrimage. If you know, I'm sure you've heard me talk about it, or Elizabeth talk about it, that we spent some time this summer with John and Lois in England on a pilgrimage. We were pilgrims moving towards Canterbury, moving towards the Canterbury Cathedral. And it is like this, this image that we would have in our mind. I'd never been there before myself, but I had this image. I'd seen pictures of the cathedral was drawing us forward. We were pilgrims moving towards this image that we had of this cathedral. It was this beautiful place that we were going, and we were journeying together in fellowship with one another. And our thoughts were focused on this destination. Now, it's not that we weren't enjoying the journey along the way. It's not like, as somebody once said about somebody else, not very kindly, said it's not like we were so heavenly minded that we were of no earthly good. We were enjoying the earthly journey, but every place that we stopped at, every little church that we stopped at along the way reminded us that there is something greater to come. Every little church reminded us that we were moving towards this grand cathedral that was often our future. And so as I think about that, I think here we are pilgrims moving towards this heavenly kingdom, but at the same time, we are called to be people who are, as we live in fellowship with one another, are giving to the world a sign and a symbol and a foretaste of what heaven looks like, living in peace with one another, practicing justice, extending mercy, extending compassion. Because this is ultimately what heaven is going to be. It's going to be this perfect place. And we live towards that, and we live into that as a community of people. So I think the first image that we are given here is that of pilgrims who have received a heavenly calling, and we're moving in that direction, and we're living that out in fellowship with one another. But as people on pilgrimage, we need both warnings and we need encouragement. So in verse 12, as I mentioned, the word that's used in the NIV I read, it says see to it, but in another translation it says watch out. Let's watch out as people, as pilgrims on a journey. Here the writer is warning the brothers and sisters, the people of the church, to watch out for traps and snares that will pull you away from God, that will take you away from reliance upon God towards reliance upon yourself, thinking that you can make it on your own and not needing to trust God, abandoning God. The warning is watch out, don't abandon God, trust God, continue to trust God. And as a people in fellowship, as pilgrims on a journey together, we want to say to ourselves, watch out, watch out. We want to use these words to one another. When we were on our pilgrimage in England, we had to watch out that we weren't getting lost on the path. At one point, we were kind of standing at this weird intersection, and we weren't sure which direction we should be going. There was this road that looked like maybe we go down there, and we were obviously lost because somebody came along and said, do you need help, or can I help you, or can I point you in the right direction? And we said yes, and they pointed to this narrow little path that was kind of tucked between, I think, two homes, and we had to follow that path. So we want to remind one another, watch out, stay on the path that leads towards this heavenly place that we are promised, and that we stay on the path towards God. Don't abandon God. Stay on that path. We want to, as people, again, in fellowship with one another, let's watch out for one another, asking ourselves, asking one another, as people on a journey would ask, how are we feeling? Is anybody ready to pack it in? Are you tired? Are you weary? How are we feeling? How are we as a community of people living in fellowship with one another? How are we feeling? Are we tired of the journey? Do we need rest? Do we need prayer for one another? I think we also need to watch out for ourselves, and we need to be asking ourselves, how am I behaving within this community? Am I wanting to go my own way? Do I want to be in charge? Do I want to lead the pack? Or am I letting other people lead? Am I sharing? Am I watching my behavior? Am I being a servant, or am I being selfish? We need to watch out for ourselves as well. I think we need to be asking loving questions of one another. If you know me, or maybe if you follow me on Facebook, you might have seen that I enjoy reading biographies around Christmas. And a number of years ago, I read a book by a journalist named David Gregory. David Gregory is an American journalist. He was famous for the show called Meet the Press. And he was so famous that he was even given sort of access into the president's office. So he could sit down with the president. And at one point, about 10 years ago, he was on a, not only, he was on a very, upward career trajectory, doing very well in his career. And he was sort of, his spiritual life had sort of lapsed. He had not paid attention to it. And he realized this. And so he started on this spiritual quest. And that became known to the point that he sat down across the desk from George W. Bush. And George W. Bush, before they got into the business that he was there for, leaned across the desk and said to David Gregory, "How's your faith? How's your faith?" And that's just such a compelling question that we should be comfortable and learn to ask one another. How is your faith? Are we asking that question to one another? And if we're not, why? Is it too awkward? It's not because we don't care. We care for one another. But are we willing to ask these questions to one another? It's a way of watching out for one another. How's your faith? Or other related questions, similar questions. Can I pray for you? I think sometimes we just find those things a little bit awkward, or we think it's going to make the other person feel awkward, and we don't ask those questions. And perhaps we need a bit of a culture change. And when an organization or a community, in order to change culture, there needs to be a motivation. And maybe we can be motivated by this image of pilgrims on a journey together who are watching out for one another. And asking these questions is a way of watching out for one another. So practice it. Practice it with the person you're closest to, maybe first. And then let's be brave. Let's ask one another, how are you doing? How's your faith? How can I pray for you? Let's watch out for one another. Verse 13 then goes on and it says, but encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today. So we not only watch out for one another as pilgrims, as people living in fellowship with one another, but we encourage one another. We encourage one another to keep going. We remind one another that this is the journey and this is our destination. We remind one another to lift our eyes, take it off the path and look to the horizon. At one point on the Pilgrim's Way, when you're getting close to Canterbury, there is a vantage point where you can look across and get your first sighting of the cathedral. It's a long way in a distance, it's hard to see, but there it is. And so we encourage one another. We want to be people who encourage one another to remember our destination, to remember that we have this promise of a life together with God in perfect harmony, in perfect peace, in perfect relationship. And that's the direction we're going. That's our destination. And so I think likewise, as people on a physical pilgrimage will encourage one another, we want to encourage one another that this is what the journey is like, that this is our purpose. Later in the book of Hebrews, you might be familiar with the words where the writer says, encourage one another towards love and good deeds. Let's encourage one another, even as Elaine did this morning, saying, let's make 2023 a year of compassion, where we practice compassion with one another. Let's encourage one another to practice love, to practice good deeds in the midst of a world that is hungry for love, that is hungry for good deeds, not selfish deeds, not evil deeds, not a world lacking love, but practicing love. Let's practice love to one another and encourage one another in this way. I want to close with John 13, verses 34 and 35. It's this reminder Jesus is teaching his disciples about what it means to live in community together. This takes place on the night before, on the night that he was betrayed, on the night before he died. Jesus is in the upper room speaking to his disciples, and he says, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." We talked about at the very beginning that song has a spiritual significance because there's this divine element to it, that as we live in fellowship with one another, we are invited into the Trinity. We are we're participating in the divine love of the Trinity. And here again is this mysterious promise that says the way that we love one another will be a witness to the world and a light to the world. By this will the world know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. So friends, church, I look forward to 2023 together. I look forward to being a community who loves one another, who serves one another, who encourages one another, and who even says, "Watch out," and asks these questions to one another. And I'm going to invite Elizabeth to come up and pray for us in this way.